So I recently undertook a 30 days to learn pixel art challenge, and this was coming from a baseline of not having really drawn any sort of pixel art. I've dabbled every now and again, but not like solidly done sprites like multiple days within a week. So I just wanted to try and test myself, because one of the biggest issues I have when making games is when it comes to the art stage, I just have to give up because I don't have any art skills. And obviously there are asset packs and stuff like that, but I don't want to spend money. So yeah, I wanted to try to upskill and learn how to do some pixel art. So I downloaded a Sprite, and I want to go through the sprites that I made, and then I'm going to share some sort of resources that I used to try to learn. So this was day one. I'd been really into watching the anime Feran. You can see here there's two magical staffs, and these are the staffs from the show. And there's a few anime things that pop up every now and again. But I did these, and I was like, oh, actually, I quite like these. I didn't immediately hate everything that I'd ever done. So yeah, this was day one. And then carrying on with the staff theme, I wanted to do kind of my own sort of wooden staff design, and you can see two versions here. One's a lower resolution, one's a double resolution, and there's also this weird tree stump of mushrooms. I don't know what that was about, but yeah, again, I liked what I did here. I kind of theme throughout all of these is I'm not very good at shading, and I don't think I improved much at all during the time doing this challenge in terms of shading. I just couldn't wrap my head around it. I think that's something that you would really have to focus on as an element of your pixel art. But I just wanted to get a baseline down of making sprites. And what actually started all of this, I was working on a game, like an idle clicker game. And I was kind of enjoying the game progress, but then it got to the bit where I'd done a lot of the systems, but I just needed some art for it. It looked terrible. So I wanted some art, and I needed little cultist sprites. So I had an attempt, and this was the first time attempting to do a character, and I don't like these that much. I mean, they're not awful. Out of the two, I think I quite like this guy. I think it's just literally because you can see his eyes, and obviously there's no animations to these or anything. That's something else I didn't get chance to try, is animation stuff during this 30-day thing. So yeah, I did these kind of characters. Next up, I followed a tutorial just to try to get used to limited color palettes. Obviously this is a Game Boy Sprite kind of theme. I quite like how these have turned out. So we've got a chest, a vending machine, a book, and a Pokeball. Yeah, I quite like these. They're very, very simple. You know, they're not very big. So it was, you know, they're quite easy to do. It didn't take a lot of skill to do that. And I wanted to give buildings a go. So you can see I started to try to do a building here. It's like, I didn't particularly like it. I don't know. I can't remember why I stopped working on it. Like, it looks fine. It's just unfinished. You know, I could have carried on decorating around that. But then I remembered a while ago when I was trying to learn 3D modeling, as part of that I undertook trying to recreate Nook's Cranny from Animal Crossing in Blender. So I thought I'd try and redo that in pixel art. So this is where I got to with that. I'm quite happy with this little rendition. You know, the slats on the roof, the kind of paneling, I think looks quite nice with the shading. I tried to get the wood panels looking nice. There's a lack of shading on these. I think, you know, you can't necessarily tell they're wood. Obviously the Nook's Cranny picture here is quite low resolution because I've scaled it down. But, you know, even in this, you can kind of see there's just different tones of colour within the wood. Maybe I should have tried to replicate that, but I was just trying to keep it simple. But yeah, I think I did an okay job at doing that. Again, it's unfinished. This box isn't there. This thing isn't here. The notice board is a bucket, for example. But I quite like where that ended up. Next up, I worked on this sword in a stone. The actual sword I quite like, but you know, it's only 1 to 3 pixels wide. You know, it wasn't necessarily hard to do. I mainly did this because I wanted to give like rocks and grass and like moss a bit of a try. I quite like these mossy shapes, but the actual rock just looks weird. Like, all the shading is completely wrong on this. Again, shading just really wasn't a strong point of my sort of time doing this challenge. But overall, you know, as only my 6th sprite, I quite happy with that. And then I went back to the Game Boy kind of color aesthetic thing. And again, just following along with a tutorial. I did this little character. I quite like the little character. And then there's a bookshop. And then as I was working on this, I kind of got to the point where I thought, you know what, I've kind of got what I want from this. I could carry it on. I didn't have any references. I wasn't feeling very inspired, so I didn't actually finish doing it. But what I did do, I quite like this look, and keeping the palette really low. Low colors is actually really helpful in trying to figure out actual shapes and different types of shading. So yeah, that was that one. And then next up, I did a sketch in my sketchbook a while ago of this weird woodland creature for something that I was trying to work on, and I quite like the look of this. I think out of all of the sprites that I did, I really like this one the most, I think. Other than the final one that I did, I quite like the final one. But again, shading's just an issue. You can't really see what's going on. I guess it just looks like he has a big belly, which wasn't really my goal with this. I don't like the kind of just weird sort of creaturey sprites. Think like something from Ghibli. There's not a huge amount of form to them in what I was thinking of. But, you know, overall, I think I got the kind of core details of the pale body with the kind of like tattooy sort of arm work and colouring on the skin. And then I like the wood mask and the eyes. I'm quite happy with that. And then I wanted to give, I think a lot of the rest of the sprites, not all of them, but I wanted to focus on characters because, you know, you can make background sprites relatively easy, but if you can't get a character right, that's the main sort of like interaction with your game that a player has, so you need to have a good character. And I started off doing this guy with a gun, and I was following along with something that allowed, it was to make your sprites in grayscale, just using values and tone to try to focus on shading, and then you can put a color layer on over the top. And, you know, I don't know, these colors are awful. I don't know why I chose those colors of the sort of shirt and pants and sleeves, but you know, it's quite good to sort of focus on the shading and the tones and then just put color on over it, and then you can then go in and tweak the individual colors within that sort of like the yellow range, for example. So yeah, that was that character. I quite like this sprite. I think the proportions are generally okay. Maybe this arm needs to be bent a bit. I quite like the little low resolution gun that I did as well. Next up, I did this frog warrior person thing. Again, I quite like the sort of head of the frog. The actual body, I don't really know what's going on here. I guess they're wearing armor, but not fully covering themselves. But yeah, in terms of proportions and stuff, I quite like this. Following on with the character theme, one thing that I did see in a lot of tutorials was when you're trying to learn characters, you can pick a sprite in the style of what you want to make. If you lower the transparency, you can then make a skeleton of how you think the character would look below that, and then use that to sort of draw over. And again, you can see me using a tone sort of grayscale color ramp here to just put in some colors and some highlights, and then doing the coloring layer on top. Now in Sprite, the coloring layer doesn't seem to work like it does in Photoshop, which is what the specific tutorial I was following about doing it this way with the grayscale and the coloring. That seemed to work a lot better. The colors I was getting out of my color layer in Sprite I couldn't really tweak them as much as I would have liked. You kind of plop any kind of color down in the gray range and it just seemed to look like this. So yeah, the coloring itself, not a massive fan of. But yeah, again, the proportions, it's a different style of character, right? But I quite like what this little character here. Next up, I had an idea for this little cat bandana wearing army, like almost like guerrilla warfare cat. I've done it in two different styles, one with a solid black outline, and then one with the black outline in some places, and then just a darker colour outline around it. And again, I quite like these. I think this would make a nice little character for a game. Here's a potential helmet that it could have worn. Yeah, I mean, not much to say about it, but I do quite like this sort of cat design. Next up, again, following on from having sprites as references and sort of using them to get skeletons and drawing over them. You can see there's a little witchy kind of character here that I've made. This is Chrono from Chrono Trigger. Using Chrono from Chrono Trigger came up a lot in a lot of different tutorials, actually, because he's proportioned so well. For being such a small kind of sprite, you can very clearly see, like, you know, there's his fingers, there's his thumb, his nose has got the highlight on, his eyes aren't that big, they're only 2 pixels tall. So I wanted to kind of try to mimic the sizing and the style just to sort of get the proportions right. I don't know what's really going on with this character's feet, but everything from like the hat down to its hands I quite like. See, it's got a pair of scissors in its apron here. And then following on with the anime theme, I'd just been watching Kaiju number 8, and I really liked the main character, Kfka, and I wanted to try to recreate this sprite, like his head, in pixel art, and I had 2 attempts at this. This was the first attempt. It was slightly higher resolution than the second attempt. And I spent so long trying to get the curve of this horn right, and then like the bone of the skull. And I think I did eventually get it there, but I was getting so frustrated. I just couldn't get it working correctly. And then I gave up here whilst trying to do the teeth. I just couldn't figure out how to do the teeth well. Maybe I should have had less teeth and had them a bit more distinct. You can see I went like lower resolution for the next one, and that was even harder, getting the kind of curve of the horn. And then the teeth were just a stupid amount of just 1 pixel gaps. It doesn't even look like teeth anymore necessarily. So yeah, both of them were obviously unfinished. Following up from that, again, using references, and you can see trying to get a skeleton here based on these sprites. So these sprites I found on Pinterest. I think they were originally from a Reddit post. And that Reddit post was about these sprites are in the style of the game Moonlighter. And I liked the top-down look to these, where you can see like the top of the head, and then the face has got the front of the face. That's what this line is. That's the eye line. So I did a different rendition of that weird baby creature, woodland baby creature, in a bit more of a lower resolution style, following this kind of sizing. And I quite liked how that one turned out. Again, I think that's one of the better sprites that I did. You can see that the cat character here I tried to do from earlier in this style. I was attempting here to get the hair shading right, but like you can see here there's big blocks of colour. They're not really broken up. I was trying to mimic that here, but again, I don't think I did a very good job at that. But yeah, here's the cat character. Now, this sprite here, the one we're looking at, I really like. It's not perfect, but for a low resolution Eron Jerger from Attack on Titan, I quite like it. I like the nose sort of like line here. And then I want it to go bigger, and I made a monstrosity. I'm not gonna lie. So here's bigger Eron Jerger. Like, what is this? His head's massive, his arms are tiny. I don't know what was going on here. No, let's just move on. But next up, I went back to the Feran anime. Again, I was happily watching it at the time, and I wanted to do the 2 main characters in sort of like low pixel art style here. So here on the left we have Fern, and here on the right we've got Feran. And this was quite nice, just trying to get the kind of different parts of their clothing kind of represented in the pixel art, whilst trying to keep the palette low. I didn't want to introduce loads of colours, and I quite like what I've done here. You can see here I've used different tones to try and get the ripples of her robe. The hair, trying to separate like the back ponytail from the pigtails from the front. Getting the kind of shape of the elf ears. It was quite a nice little sort of task. After the end of this, I was like quite happy with how they looked. Again, for my skill level, they're not amazing. And then by this point, I was kind of running out of inspiration of like what specifically I wanted to make when I opened up a sprite. because I wasn't working on a game, I was just doing random sprites. And I came across a Blue Sky account called Pixel Dailies. And in Pixel Dailies, every day they post a prompt for a piece of pixel art. So the first day that I found this account, the prompt was door. And this is the door from the anime Suzume, which plays a really big role in the film. Again, I like this. It has quite bold shading. You've got the kind of paint flaking off, the kind of greenery of the leaves. And by this point, I was very much into using references, and that's something I didn't do earlier on. But you can see here, using PureRef, I just got a couple of references of the door. This was the main one, obviously, that I used. We're trying to get the leaves, and this has got quite like harsh shading with the harsh line, so I was trying to replicate that in the door frame. We've got the bricks here, and then I used the blue background because it's sat in water. And then while I was looking up reference images, I remembered that Daijin existed, which is this really cute cat. Specifically this image here I quite liked, so I wanted to recreate that in pixel art. Again, I really like that. So this was, I didn't trace the image, I just had it up here on the left and I was doing this on the right with my mouse. But it was a good kind of test to try to get some more complex shapes. I was really struggling with shapes and things. So making shapes like this was quite a bit of good practice. Trying to get the kind of like chunky whisker bits here correct. They're not perfect, these, but you know, I'm quite happy when you compare this pixel art to this, considering this is only my, like, you know, however many sprites in this is. I was quite happy with that. The next one up, I'm not particularly happy with. So I got more sprites from Chrono Trigger. These are the main characters, and then there's also an NPC, which you can see is a bit smaller than the main cast. Again, using the kind of images as reference to get like where the head is and where the hands should be. So this was for day 2 of Pixel Dailies. The prompt for this day was protagonist, and this is the protagonist from the Mistborn books, Vin. And you can see here, Vin's supposed to have this big tassel-y coat, green trousers, and she regularly is barefoot. You see in most of the images she's barefoot, so I kept that there. I was trying to get the kind of mist cloak-esque look, but there's so many tassels and such few pixels. What's ended up happening is actually it just looks like a big cloak, and maybe there are folds in the cloak. It doesn't look like a the mist coat thing. So yeah, and it also looks like her hair is a hood, which technically it's not. That's just her hair. Although she does have a hood here, so you know, maybe that's fine. Yeah, but she doesn't actually have a hood. That's supposed to be her hair. The following day was of Pixel Dailies was Curse. So I did this book, and it was the first time trying to do something with a bit of perspective to it, really. I quite like the book. I think, you know, getting the individual pages with this colouring I did quite well. Other than that, it's obviously very simple. I was just trying to doodle something here. And then I wanted smoke around it, and then realised I couldn't do smoke. It's actually very complicated. And I was doing these like wispy shapes, but then I realised they actually looked like tentacles. So I just coloured them as if they were tentacles, and I figured, you know, curses, Cthulhu, tentacles, you know, it's all in the same sort of ballpark. So that brought me to the end of week 3 of the 4 weeks I was trying to do. Unfortunately, I got very busy at work, so I couldn't complete I didn't really do anything. Well, I didn't do anything at all pixel art for that last week of the 30 days. But I didn't want to end this with this being my last image, so I put together this image. I'm quite happy with this. This was the last image. I was trying to take what I'd learned about shading, and you know, you can see I've brought a rock in. I quite like the rock a bit more here. It's obviously a lot more simple than the rock from the Sword in the Stone, but the shading's a bit more correct. Again, based on tutorials I'd been watching. The actual Torii gate, the shading up here is not perfect, but I like what I've done with the shading here. That does actually look quite cylindrical. And then the heron at the front, This was really difficult to do the heron. It was quite a complicated shape, getting this curve and the beak. But again, using references, it made this a lot easier. So you can see here's my references. We've got a mix of, there's two Tory gates there. And then this one here where I was trying to kind of get the shading from. Just realised I've missed off doing like a plaque at the top. Oh well. And then a couple of heron images, trying to get like the shape of the neck conveyed, and then the body. This was the main reference that I'd used. I used this one to try to get the beak colouring and this kind of like bandana look thing that it's got going on. I really like herons, and I love Japan. So yeah, that was my kind of final piece of artwork. I feel like I came a long way doing this. I don't think I didn't fully commit to one sprite every day for 30 days, unfortunately. It's just not how life works sometimes. Full-time job, many different hobbies, trying to do game development alongside this of a different game. But yeah, that was kind of my journey through trying to learn pixel art in 30 days. As promised, I wanted to just go over a few of the different channels that I used to learn pixel art. The first one was Mislav 1-Bit Studio. This person's got a load of really useful shorts about everything, like how to make different textures, materials, shapes, just all sorts. Yeah, really useful shorts. And then they've done compilations of those shorts into long form videos if you'd prefer to watch them kind of like all in a row. Different tutorials about Sprite. Yeah, this is just a really, really good channel. Next up was Brandon James Greer. A lot of the Game Boy stuff that I did was following their tutorial. You can see here's the Chrono Trigger one, using the kind of Chrono sprites as references to make little skeletons. Next up was Soul Tunes. There's some really interesting stuff on Soul's channel that I really like. Yeah, I'd highly recommend following along with some of Soul's stuff. Next up is Pixel Overload. There's some really good stuff on this channel. Unfortunately, they upload kind of really infrequently, but there's stuff, about rocks. There's time lapses, so you can just watch what they've been up to. Stuff about doing things for the Nokia games, different canvas size bits. It's just a really interesting channel with really high quality artwork. It just really helps get inspired, even if you're just following along with, even if you're just watching the kind of paint alongs. And then obviously you can't do pixel art learning challenges without mentioning Adam C. Eunice, who's working on his game Insignia. There's just so much really good, well presented, eloquently put tutorials about pixel art on here, and some stuff about actual game development as well, some movement, state machines. But you can see I've watched quite a lot of Adam's videos. Just a really, really good, invaluable channel with lots and lots of useful stuff on there. But yeah, hopefully that inspired you in some way. You can see that, you can go from making really bad sprites of cultists to making something that, I really like this image. I'm quite proud of it. And considering I didn't do every day for 30 days, I'm happy with that. So if you decide to do this sort of challenge, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to see everyone's progress doing something like this. Yeah, big shout out to all those resources who kind of helped me along on this journey. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.